So I've been thinking about narratives lately and the stories we have in our life that give life meaning. And I've been thinking about how I have lacked a common narrative with many people for a long time. And I really felt this profoundly when I left Tucson. And of course I was very hurt and confused. But I just felt like I was floating, and it didn't matter which path I took, it would all end up in the same place. But over time, that has deepened, and like any human being, I'm not the first person to find myself in this position. Whenever people lose someone that they love, or they have some disruption in their life, they can often find themselves in this very existential place where suddenly there's no connection to community, your storyline is disrupted, and you're just existing, basically. And that is really a tense situation at first, and it causes a lot of anxiety. But over time, it just becomes the norm. So what I found is that when I go out and try to join social situations, because I'm human and I am a social animal, and I don't want to feel that anxiety. I do want some meaning in my life. I go out and, I'll date someone, or I'll find a group that's under some topic that I think might be interesting, and I'll join that group. And inevitably, I find myself in the same place. And if it's a dating situation, I end up having somebody in my living room telling me all about their life. And I wonder how much of it I'm supposed to be remembering. Is it something I should be doing something about so that the person feels that I'm interested in their life? But a lot of times what they're telling me is just not very compelling, and I don't know what to do with the information. And the same happens if I join a group. Oftentimes the topic of the group becomes secondary to the socializing within the group. So you go to these places and the people there are talking about, a shopping experience or something they bought that didn't work out, or their cousin's getting a divorce, and that's all fine, and of course if somebody's telling me something that is, traumatic and it's about their survival in life, it's certainly, as a human being, I'm interested in being compassionate. But oftentimes what's being talked about is, it just does not capture my interest. Whereas the topic, oftentimes does. That's why I joined the group. But for some reason, people find the topics of groups secondary to the socializing. And all of that would be fine, except that there seems to be a standard narrative that people in society connect into. And it's almost like there's a story going on, and I missed the first part, and I'm not sure about the character development, and everybody else seems to know what's going on except me. And so I find myself sitting there often, and I try they're talking about a shopping experience, and I'll go through my catalog and try to think of an interesting shopping experience so that I can feel a part. It's not something I'm really interested in. It's just something I'm saying in order to feel a part of the social group, which of course is boring. And, and then I'm talking and I feel alone in a group, and I can just go home and be alone. And the thing is, though, is time went on and I found myself in these existential moments. What I began to realize is there are narratives that do interest me. And, for instance, poetry. I can find poetry to be so compelling in that it exposes an underlying reality. It exposes an underlying story that's going on in either my personal life or in the life of my community or whatever. And it always does it in sort of a roundabout, prismatic way. It comes around the corners, and then there's this aha, here is the narrative, here is the story. And that is something I love to read and I love to talk about. I lived in a very small town. There wasn't much to do. And then I started reading a lot of science magazines like Scientific American, and Science. And, there was a whole collection of them in the library. And I read them cover to cover often. And I began to see these wonderful stories about, there's just so much going on in the sciences right now that is fascinating and worthy of interaction as a human being. And things, for instance, right now there are discussions going on about ecology, biology, and gender. And first of all, the idea that human beings are the dominant species on the planet is being questioned, and the science behind that is interesting. There's the idea that all living things are not binary in gender, and that in fact there are living beings on this planet who are here for other reasons than reproduction. And then if you take that into ecology, the ecology of the planet, anyway, expands out into really fascinating discussions. And those narratives I would wholeheartedly find myself interacting with. And then there's politics. Politics that involves God or how pretty your flag is, I lose interest immediately. The politics of assumption that you live in the dominant society and that because you do, everything you do is the moral default, that doesn't interest me at all. However, when there's a political discussion that involves science and poetry that talks about humanity as a species on a planet and what plans we're going to make in order to survive on this planet, those are fascinating discussions. And for instance, Standing Rock was compelling to me and worthy of our attention because it mixed poetry, science, and politics together. The poetry of Standing Rock is why so many people around the world began to focus on it. The politics were amazing because it challenged the dominant narrative, and then the science about climate change and the use of fossil fuels. It was all there, and that was a narrative that I paid close attention to, and I loved talking about that. And I just think, though, that when I find myself in any social situation and I want to talk about those things, poetry, politics, sciences, and what I just read, and some exciting essay I read about biology and gender or something like that. People are busy talking about their cousin, and their shopping experiences, and they took a vacation this weekend, and so if I do find a place to bring those topics in, it's often met with confusion, and it feels disruptive, and then oftentimes people will become defensive and offensive. You get called negative or political, or you don't fit in or something like that. And so again, when I'm in, or if you have a date and they're talking about, they're telling you all about their brothers and sisters and all that stuff, and and you want to talk about ecology and Standing Rock, they're oftentimes there's no match there. So I do try to be nice, and I do try to listen to what people are saying, but I usually lose interest. And then there's another place where I find a storyline, and this is where that feeling of floating and existentialism has a benefit, and that is when I go out into nature. And I've spent a lot of time out in these forests and just sitting there. And what I find is that if I just sit in a place, and these forests are so amazing, they're so lush and filled with life, and I just sit there, and all of a sudden this theater is unfolding before your eyes. There's animals and birds and snakes and trees and plants of all variety and insects. The insects are just fascinating. Just this week there was this fly bee sort of thing, and that's exactly what it looked like. It looked like somebody had mixed a fly with a bee, a house fly with a bee. And then there was a fly in my car yesterday, and it was about that big, and it was green, and it looked like a housefly, but it was just green and luminescent and almost fluorescent. And then I was sitting at a picnic bench, and I had my hand on the bench, and this worm comes up, and this worm is a few centimeters across, and it moves like an inchworm or a centimeter worm. and I've got my hand there, and it comes across the table, and obviously it wants to see my hand, and it comes right up to the end, and it's just poking around at the end of my finger. And those moments it's just everything becomes encapsulated in that moment. And of course, people have written poetry about this, painted pictures, music. Philosophers have discussed this. What is that when you go out into nature and you suddenly feel a part of there I am, large, and this worm comes up of living beings. And there's a moment, and that existentialism is what makes it so choice, is that for a moment I can feel what I know, and what I know is that I am on this planet, and I'm surrounded right now by all this life, trees and birds and snakes and all these bugs. However, if I look at a cliff, I can look and I can see the millions of years. I look up at the sky. And I'm looking out at light years, and one light year is an enormous amount of space. And those are millions of light years. So, there's these moments of where no narrative allows a person to experience one being in this grand narrative of all these beings. No more. And whether that has a purpose or not is or less dominant sort of than I am. And certainly, I am just a part, and I mean I personally, and I as a human being, am just a part of this larger ecology. And not just the ecology of the planet, but the planet is in a solar system, in a galaxy, in a universe. And those moments are just incredible, and they are something that I like to talk about or share with other people as a narrative, as a community. And so that all being said, I do have a social network of sorts throughout my life, and I've had an unusual life than what I would say is a standard life in the United States. And it has allowed me time to experience these various moments in nature, and but also I have met people, and oftentimes strangers. Like I'll be out and I'll just sit down next to somebody, and all of a sudden we're not talking about shopping or our cousin or divorces or problems with our relationships. We're talking about poetry and politics and science and biology and ecology and experiencing nature, and those conversations shy away from these other conversations, and in fact thrive on them, and find great beauty in discussing them. And those people are my social network, and it's not easy to find sometimes. When I was taking a class at the college this past semester, I found myself around this amazing group of young people, and I think that this particular writing class was just one of those choice moments where the right group of people came together, and we were having these discussions. But I don't know why in social groups, for the most part, people shy away from that, and they refer to this standardized narrative. Don't know why. But when it goes to the other, it can be really amazing, I find. And I've met people like this my whole life. I will just sit down and start talking to somebody, and we will just be on a completely different level of discussion. So, that being said, I do think that it's like with religion. People want to put a narrative over their life so that it has a meaning, it has a storyline. And I think that's why religion is so important to people. However, to me, when I go and explore religion, to me it's just another story. There are millions of stories. And while that particular story can have wonderful metaphors, when somebody's telling me about their religion, oftentimes it sounds like, they read Harry Potter or Alice in Wonderland, and all of a sudden they're believing in it. Or it's like they're trying to sell me something. If I believe in this deity, good things are going to happen to me, like I'll get money or love or whatever. If I go to this cult, and only great things will happen to me. Another one that I find just silly is that when people use meditation as a consumer item, if you just sit quietly by yourself, all these great consumer benefits will happen. It will cure your depression and your anxiety, and it will help you succeed in business, and buy this yoga book and this yoga mat and these yoga pants, and you're on your way, man. And the thing is that it's politics, poetry, science. Those things engage our minds in a wonderful narrative. And if you want to explore, and don't do it because it's going to make you a better person or a worse person, do it because for a moment you will see your role in the larger theater of things. So yeah, I find social situations to be confusing and uncomfortable oftentimes. However, I think I'll go back to college, and I do find a lot of I don't know what the word is, satisfaction in education, in learning the ecology of all these narratives. Also, I'll end on this, because every narrative has a beginning, middle, and end. And that's my point, is that if you educate yourself in two ways, studying, and learning information and data about science and politics, and reading poetry and the arts to learn how humanity works. And the second way is if you just go out and be for a while. Those two things will provide what amounts to a narrative in your life. However, it will also show that there is a beginning, a middle, and an end to all of those narratives. And just because right now you feel that your narrative, your story, is dominant, it is the most common story going on, and the second way is if you just go out and be for a while, Those two things will provide what amounts to a narrative in your life. However, it will also show that there is a beginning, a middle, and an end to all of those narratives. And just because right now you feel that your narrative, your story, is dominant, it is the most common story going on, when you go out, everybody likes you because you fit right in. In fact, if you would say these same things 50 years from now or 100 years before, you would not have fit in, because narratives change. The ecology of poetry, the ecology of politics, the ecology of science, the ecology of ecology changes. And social situations, I think, are the most fun when they talk about those changes in a very open, educated, and it can even be fun and witty if you let it. Okay, so that's my story.